This is the case of Rosemary and Lovu. In the northeastern flank of Johannesburg, we find the home and workplace of Rosemary and Lovu. Rosemary was born in 1975 to her mother Maria Mishwana and a father who remains unnamed. Rosemary was Johannesburg born and bred. She grew up with a relatively normal childhood and also graduated at a high school level. In her adulthood, she was described as an average woman, and those around her would say that she could be quite brash and rather masculine in nature. She trained and gained work as a police officer, where she excelled due to her hardy nature. Although Rosemary dedicated most of her life to her work, this would not stop her from getting married. It was in the year 2011 that she met a new boyfriend, Morris Mabasa. Morris worked for the US Embassy, and he was known to be a kind and generous man, both physically and financially looking after his 13 siblings and aging mother. He had friends all over Johannesburg, and his work would take him to many provinces. From what is known, Rosemary and Maurice seemed to have a relatively happy relationship, although they were known to have the odd fight here and there. Financial struggles, long days of work, the usual things that you'd expect in mild arguments. Rosemary and Maurice were both well-paid workers and earned high in their respective fields of industry. But there was a big difference in how the two would spend their money. Although Maurice would share his wealth with his other members of family, who were often in poorer situations, Rosemary was quite the opposite. She would often spend all the money she had on herself and her gambling addiction, rather than helping out her poorer siblings and mother. And many of them quite literally lived in poverty. Due to Rosemary's nature of work, and also her family members' lifestyle and living conditions, she would often tell them that maybe they should consider getting life insurance, as the mortality rate for those living in poverty in Johannesburg is sadly very high. She often offered to file and pay for those insurance policies as she had a well-paying job within the family. And so the insurance was filed for several family members, including her cousin, witness Madala Homu. Rosemary had previously expressed to Homu's mother that she was worried for him, mostly due to the way that he conducted himself and the people that he involved himself with. She therefore encouraged Homu's mother to add him to a burial society. Homu's mother accepted, and the policy was filed with her consent. However, during this procedure, Rosemary listed herself as Homu's wife, and being his cousin, there's a few things wrong with that. A few months would pass, when suddenly in March of 2012, Homu disappeared without a trace. With the family living in poverty, and therefore having no cameras, mobile phones or social media profiles, barely any pictures of Homu or his family are available. But Homu was a family man. He loved his mother, and he was close to the rest of them too. So after vanishing with no correspondence to anyone, it was a very troubling sign for the family. Seemingly distraught by his disappearance, Rosemary spearheaded a search for her missing cousin, assuring her family that she would do her very best to try and find him. And sadly, that search didn't last too long either. Very shortly after investigations began, Homu's body was discovered just a few miles away in Olifantsfontein, a town just north of Tembisa. Autopsies discovered that the cause of his death was blunt force trauma to his head. And, rather obviously, his death was ruled as homicide. But unfortunately, these are the lower class lands of South Africa. He was just one of many murders in this area, and as a result, further investigations were sadly deemed not worth the funds or time. Witness Madala Homu was laid to rest in March of 2012, and although Rosemary had taken out insurance for her cousin, she contributed almost nothing to the funeral costs for him. In fact, despite being paid 100,000 rand or $6,500 through his death, she contributed a measly 200 rand, the equivalent of $13. Homu's family were devastated, but with barely any money, they had no time to mourn. They moved on with their working lives pretty swiftly after his death. After all, this was quite common in the area.
She out here killing the family member.
Want to join the six-figure club? Google and other tech companies are hiring hundreds of thousands of workers in non-coding.
We're moving 1 year on, and it's now June of 2013. Rosemary's sister, Audrey, who lived nearby, was in the midst of her everyday routine. That was when Rosemary called her to see if she would like to have some dinner with her later that night. Audrey was surprised by this invitation. It wasn't a usual offer from her, but she gladly accepted. She invited Rosemary over to her rented room in Tembisa, and the two proceeded to share an evening meal together. Audrey was happy to see her sister. It had been a while, and the two rarely shared an evening in each other's company. Supposedly, nothing worth mentioning happened during this dinner, and afterwards, Rosemary left Audrey's house and went back home. The very next day, to her parents' surprise, Rosemary couldn't get hold of Audrey on the phone, so with concern, she raised the alarm and requested that the police begin a search for her second missing family member. Arriving back at her sister's place the very next day, neighbours overheard screams and crying as they witnessed Rosemary grieving for the loss of her sister. Audrey had sadly been poisoned and then strangled in her very own home, before being left dead on her floor to be discovered the very next day. Prior to her own death, Audrey had taken out life and funeral insurance policies to her own name, which was kind of surprising as she could barely afford the room that she rented. The insurance and funeral payouts totaled 700,000 rand, the equivalent to $45,000, and the beneficiary to this was Rosemary. And so, another member of the family had been found dead, both from low-income households and both with life insurance, both addressed to Rosemary as the beneficiary. And just like before, this murder was barely investigated or chased up. A couple months later, in 2014, and Rosemary moved to police stations, opting to become a constable at the brand new Tembisa South station in East Rand. She would settle into her new role very quickly, her new co-workers all claiming that she was very pleasant and generous. She would often buy them all lunch, and gave loans to any of them who were in need of money. But that wasn't all the time. Some days, Rosemary would walk into the office with a very dark cloud around her, often irate and angry, complaining that she was broke, and making sure that all of her colleagues knew that. They were also aware that she had been frequenting Empress Palace in Kempton Park, a large casino in Johannesburg. It seemed as if Rosemary was frequently coming into money, only to lose it again to gambling and frivolous spending. And although Rosemary had recently started a new job, it was in the year of 2014 that she fell pregnant to her first and only child. Her name was Makanani. Maurice and Rosemary loved their daughter more than anything in this world, and they would make sure that she was happy. Maurice doing his part as a responsible father in caring for Makanani. But the birth of their new baby daughter wouldn't heal the couple's turbulent marriage. And actually, their relationship was so turbulent that Maurice would often disappear overnight when things got too much. This pattern continued until one night in October 2015. After yet another argument between the two, the couple headed their separate ways for the night, Rosemary staying with the baby, while Maurice did his usual thing by storming out the house. But, strangely enough, this time he never returned home. Being gone for more than one night had Rosemary worried. Worried enough that she went to the police station to get help. And you can probably guess where this is going. Just later that very same day, the body of a deceased man was found in the town of Olifantsfontein. A body that, soon after, would be identified as Maurice Mabasa. Maurice had faced an extremely violent death. He was riddled with more than 80 stab wounds, and after this, his body was dumped alongside a quiet road. Although the cause of his death left barely any room for imagination, the actual motive as to why he was killed was not obvious. None of his valuables had been taken from him. In fact, the way that he was identified was through his credit card in his wallet found on him. And just like before, this case was pushed under the rug, never to be investigated any further. Maurice had life insurance cover, and no surprises, Rosemary was the beneficiary. She received 400,000 rand in compensation for his death, with an extra 100,000 rand from his employer, the US Embassy. 3 deaths, 3 policies paid out to Rosemary, and 3 instances where she was now financially stronger. Surely all this death in the family was enough to raise suspicions, yet surprisingly, it didn't. We're pushing on to June 2016, and Rosemary had new company in her home. Her niece, Zanel Motha, had come to stay with her for a few weeks, as she was having financial trouble. It was during this short visit that Zanel was tragically hit by a car in Kempton Park. Miraculously, Zanel survived. She did, however, sustain several injuries, and so Rosemary kindly took her to the hospital to be checked over. Doctors who examined Zanel would find that her injuries were only superficial, and therefore she was discharged from hospital that very same day, Rosemary again taking her back home and into her care. However, that very same night, Zanel started to complain of severe pain in her chest. In fact, the pain had become so violent that she couldn't stop crying. Rosemary rushed her to the hospital the very next morning, and, upon arrival, only one of them was breathing. When examined, Zanel only had a few abrasions on her face, but the real problem was internally, where she had multiple fractured ribs, and her liver was severely damaged. Doctors sadly couldn't do anything for Zanel. There was no way that they would have discharged her the previous day if she had these injuries. The conclusion was that this must have happened after she was discharged. When asked by doctors, Rosemary said that she had no idea how this could have happened. Apparently, Rosemary had been out of the house for most of that day, so maybe it was accidental and self-inflicted. Lo and behold, Zanel did in fact have a life insurance policy, and Rosemary was again the beneficiary. She received 120,000 rand, the equivalent of $7,500. Authorities didn't question the circumstances, therefore no investigations were ever conducted. Another member of the family gone, and still no suspicion from anyone. Who exactly knows what happened to Zanel that fateful night? Unfortunately, the final chapter to her life would die alongside her. Book shut, case closed.
There's nothing more powerful than creating a track, but sometimes creating music can be challenging.
After the death of Zanel, Rosemary began to get closer to more members of her family, namely Zanel's brother, Mayeni Mashaba. By April of 2017, Mayeni was due to visit Pretoria, a city just north of Johannesburg, and Rosemary, wanting to be closer with her nephew, offered to drive him halfway, where he could then hitch a ride from a gas station. Mayeni agreed. Rosemary dropped him off as planned on the R21, before heading back to her own home late that evening. And the very next day, she received a phone call from the police. They had found a body in Olifantsfontein, and after investigating, it was identified to be Mayeni. Another death, and another insurance claim to be filed. Only this time, the insurance company was a little more thorough. On the policy, Rosemary was listed as Mayeni's partner. Again, kind of gross. And as she couldn't produce any proof of such a relationship, the claim was ultimately rejected, Rosemary receiving nothing. And that pattern continued later in 2017. As in April of that year, Rosemary's nephew named Brilliant Mashego suddenly disappeared, only to be found dead several days later. The records of Brilliant's cell phone pinpointed that the last person to see him alive was Rosemary, and Rosemary's records highlighted that the two were together for most of the previous day, driving from Johannesburg to Bushbuck Bridge before parting ways in the evening. Rosemary denied these claims, and even further, she refused to be questioned about it by authorities. Similar circumstances to before, Brilliant had 3 life insurance policies to his name, with Rosemary listed as the beneficiary as his mother. However, without being able to provide any proof of this, the claim was ultimately rejected. With not 1 but 6 family members now dead through strange circumstances, I'm sure even Rosemary wondered if she could ever be stopped from her killing spree. She had evaded the law 6 times, and she had no plans to stop either. And that would be the case until the year 2018. With 2 murders in the family fruitless due to rejected insurance claims, Rosemary was getting desperate. She was low on money, and she needed to make more people disappear, and fast. And this time, she would source the help of a hitman named Njabulu Kunene. Being a police officer, she had found him through her field of work, already arresting Kunene several years ago for possessing a gun. She approached him with a plot to kill her own sister, Joyce, and, disturbingly, her request also included killing all 5 of Joyce's children, the youngest being only 6 months old. Kunene was by no means a saint, but he was shocked by her request. With a command so evil, Kunene couldn't go ahead with it. So instead, he approached police with the information that he had, despite that same information being enough to criminalize himself. He shared everything, telling the police about her background, her plot, and her motive. And in response, police decided to employ Knene to be a part of an undercover plot to acquire more evidence. The plan was simple enough, police discreetly fitting his car with a video camera. All they needed was for Knene to somehow lure Rosemary into the passenger seat and unknowingly confess to her own plans. Knene called Rosemary, asking her if she could meet him to iron out the details. She agreed, and this time Knene would have an accomplice, who was actually an undercover police officer. She agreed to drive the pair to Bushbuck Ridge, about a 5 hours drive from Johannesburg. This was in order to show them where her sister and her children lived, and how exactly she wanted them to be killed. The sting operation was a great success, and what Rosemary was caught saying on camera is haunting.
ayikho emakhaya yabona ukushisa number 1 nokuhamba number 1 sona lezi ngicabanga ukuthi manje ne basihamba manje ngiyohlangana naye ngimbize sihlangane somewhere mina mhlambe ngifake imoto laphana yabona ngimnikezele laphilisi ujabuza lwana ngimtshele ngidlamaphilisi asiza ntambama ulala uwaphuza womkhuhlane angithi manje ngizingene sithi nomkhuhlane ngithi niwaphuze mani lala ngoba ayalalisana then mina ngizokhona ukungena nje akunamabhakla laphana ngibuyela la esibhedlela ngibuyela la esibhedlela nayo babedlini uyazi ukuthi ngila esibhedlela so la esibhedlela ngicelile banginikeze iphasawuthi bathe ngibuye ngo-4 so lana noma ngafika ngo-5 6 7 akunandaba esilonge ngidlulile so ngoba ngithi indawo ethisa ifuna ngishise kusebusuku ngiklini mina ngingacala ngazi bahle bangitshela indaba mina kusasa ngiyavuka ngiyagijima ngiyekhaya cela amayongiselelo ngiyaklina ngenza zonke lezi.
Needless to say, Rosemary was arrested just moments after showing the hitmen her sister's house. The following court case was a lengthy one. Beginning in 2018, she was trialed for 6 counts of murder for the lives of her cousin, Madala Homu, her sister, Audrey Ndlovu, her boyfriend, Morris Mabasa, her niece, Manel Motha, and her nephews, Mayani Mashaba and Brilliant Machego. And throughout her killing spree, Rosemary had pocketed 1.4 million rand from several insurance payouts, totaling around $90,000 or £65,000. Throughout her trial, the court found it difficult to gather sufficient evidence to support all 6 murders, as there was never much of an investigation into any individual case. And as a result, the court had to take a substantial amount of time to build this unique case against her. 3 years later, on the 22nd of October 2021, Rosemary Ndlovu's trial began. The court amassed a total of 40 witnesses to come forward and testify against Rosemary, which included family members, colleagues, and the 2 hitmen that she had attempted to hire to kill her sister. As proceedings began, Rosemary was jovial towards the court and often posed for cameras, seemingly unaware of how serious her situation was. Families of those deceased took to the stand to comment on how unfeeling and flippant she was at the funerals of their loved ones. It was also highlighted that, even though she was the one to prepare and file those insurance policies, she was also always the last person to see the victim alive, and barely contributed towards funeral costs. It wasn't until the unflattering coincidences started piling up that Rosemary began to get hostile. She outright denied any involvement in any of these murders, meeting these allegations with anger and rudeness. She even got angry at journalists simply for recording her. Regardless of this, at the end of her trial, she insisted that she was innocent, but did apologize to the families and friends of those who had been killed and asked for forgiveness. It didn't take long for Rosemary's verdict to be made. In October of 2021, Rosemary Ndlovu was found guilty on all charges, which included 6 counts of premeditated murder, 4 counts of fraud, and 7 incitements to commit murder. She was therefore served with 6 life sentences, 70 years for incitement to commit murder, and a further 10 years for her counts of fraud. Rosemary will be 71 before she is even considered for parole.
Savage, boy.
Speaking about her in the nicest kind of way, Rosemary was a selfish monster with a gambling addiction who saw her own family members as a commodity to trade for monetary gain. This story is both sad and heartbreaking, and through her path of destruction, she has left a huge hole in her own family. A family who inherently loved and trusted her, some of them to their very end. But on a more positive note, a mother and her 5 children were all spared their lives with thanks to the conscience of Rosemary's hitman. And who knows who else he has saved in this process. Wrapping up this case, I want to leave you with the interview of Rosemary's sister, who now has to deal with the thought that her very own sister tried to burn her alive. I don't have anything. Even my house was built by the government. It pains me, as she's been employed for a very long time. Is she not embarrassed by the fact that she wanted to set me alight in a government house? I am unemployed. I do not own anything. And after that, they took Rosemary back to the car. I kept wondering what was happening. They then said what had brought them here. It was that I would be dying today with my children at 9 o'clock. They said my sister had bought petrol and cold drink, and poured drugs, which would make me not feel anything when we burn. I wondered why she wanted to kill me, when I had nothing. I felt sorry for her when I saw her in court, but then I remembered that my kids and I were supposed to be dead. And that just about wraps up today's case. Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. You know the drill by now. As always, I look forward to seeing you again real soon in the next video. Until that moment arrives though, look after each other. Goodbye.